there is a photograph. It was taken in 1939. A young woman, 17 years old, standing in a blue gingham dress, holding a small dog. Her eyes are wide open. And if you look closely enough, if you really look, you can see it. Not the wonder, not the innocence, something else entirely. Something behind the eyes that says, I have already learned that no one is coming to save me. The world would spend the next 30 years calling her a legend, an icon, the greatest entertainer who ever lived. They would sing about her at her funeral. They would weep in the streets of New York. They would name concert halls after her memory. And none of it, not one single word of it, would arrive in time to matter. Because the woman they were praising was gone long before she was dead. She was taken, piece by piece, by the very industry that made her famous, by the studio that signed her at 13, by the mother who traded her for relevance, by the men who saw in a child's voice nothing more than a revenue stream. Her name was Frances Ethel Gumm. You know her as Judy Garland. And this is not the version of her story that Hollywood has ever wanted you to hear. Part 2, Biographical Foundation, 8 to 12 minutes, tone, steady and authoritative, building the world she came from. To understand what happened to Judy Garland, you have to understand where she came from. Not the Hollywood version, the real one. Grand Rapids, Minnesota, June 10th, 1922. A cold, flat, unremarkable town in the American Midwest. A town of mills and churches and long winters. Into this town was born the youngest child of Frances and Ethel Gumm. They named her Frances, after both of her parents, as if she were already, from birth, not quite her own person. Frances Gumm ran a small movie theater in Grand Rapids. He was a gentleman, a man who loved music and loved his daughters. But Frances Gumm had a secret, one that, in 1922, in a small Minnesota town, had no safe name, no safe space, no possibility of acknowledgement. He was attracted to men. And the rumors, as rumors do in small towns, began to spread. By 1926, the family had no choice. They packed their lives and moved west, to Lancaster, California, to a new theater, a new start, a new silence around the same secret. Ethel Gumm was a different kind of person entirely. She had dreamed of being a performer herself, a real one, a famous one, the kind whose name appeared in lights. But that dream had not materialized. And so, as certain kinds of parents do, she transferred the weight of that dream onto her children, specifically onto the youngest one, the one with the voice. Frances could sing before she could read. She had what performers call natural pitch, the ability to hold a note not just with accuracy but with feeling. At 2.5 years old, she walked onto the stage of her father's theater during a Christmas performance and sang a chorus of Jingle Bells. The audience erupted. And Ethel Gumm saw something in that moment that would define the next 2 decades of her daughter's life. She saw possibility, not her daughter's joy, her daughter's talent, the possibility of what that talent could become. The Gumm sisters, Frances and her 2 older sisters, Mary Jane and Dorothy, began touring the vaudeville circuit, town after town, stage after stage. Ethel managed them, arranged the bookings, chose the costumes, decided what they sang and how they stood. Frances was not a child who performed. She was a product being carefully manufactured. By 1928, the family had enrolled the girls in a dance school run by Ethel Meglin, proprietor of the Meglin Kiddies dance troupe. Their first film appearance followed shortly after. A short subject called The Big Review, in which they sang and danced for a camera that would preserve them permanently. Frances was 6 years old. the family relocated again, eventually settling in a world that orbited Hollywood, and Ethel began pulling every string she could find to get her daughters in front of the right people. Then, in November 1935, a month that would permanently alter the course of Frances Gumm's life, two things happened. The first was that her father, the gentle Francis Gumm, was admitted to the hospital with meningitis. Frances was told while she was preparing for a radio performance. She went on anyway, because she had been trained since childhood that the show comes first. The following morning, her father was dead. He was 49 years old. She was 13, and the one person in her life who had loved her simply for being his daughter was gone. The second thing that happened that month, she signed a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The most powerful film studio in the world had noticed the Garland sisters performing at the Orpheum Theatre in Los Angeles. Songwriter Burton Lane had been sent to observe them on behalf of studio chief Louis B. Mayer. A few days later, Frances and her father, who would be dead before the month was out, were brought in for an impromptu audition at the MGM Studios in Culver City. She performed Zing, Went the Strings of My Heart. The studio signed her immediately, a salary of $100 a week, a princely sum during the Depression. But money was not what they were purchasing. They were purchasing a voice, a talent, a girl they would spend the next 15 years shaping, restricting, chemically altering, and ultimately discarding when she became inconvenient. The studio didn't quite know what to do with her at first. She was 13, too old for child roles, too young for adult ones. She was 4 feet 11.5 inches tall. Her face was, as they put it, girl next door. Not glamorous enough, not thin enough, not quite right. Studio chief Louis B. Mayer was not a gentleman. He was a man who had built an empire on the bodies and talents of people he considered, at some fundamental level, to be instruments, tools for the creation of profit. He referred to Frances Gumm, now rechristened Judy Garland, a name borrowed from a song and a comment about looking like a garland of flowers, as his little hunchback. She was a child, and the most powerful man in Hollywood called her his little hunchback, because she was less than 5 feet tall and had a slight curvature of the spine. She went to school at the MGM studio lot alongside Ava Gardner, Lana Turner, and a young Elizabeth Taylor. Real beauties, said director Charles Walters, who worked with her throughout this period. Judy was the big moneymaker at the time, a big success, but she was the ugly duckling. I think it had a very damaging effect on her emotionally for a long time. I think it lasted forever, really. She wore removable caps on her teeth, rubberized discs to reshape her nose, costumes designed not to flatter her figure, but to disguise it. She was dressed in frilly gowns that made her look younger and plain clothing that made her look less threatening to the glamorous women on the lot. She was, even then, being erased. And then came 1938, and with it, a yellow brick road, and a blue gingham dress, and a song that would define her entire life, for better and for worse. Part 3. The Turn, 12 to 18 minutes. Tone. The voice begins to carry grief, facts delivered like evidence. In 1938, when Judy Garland was 16 years old, she was cast as Dorothy Gale in what would become one of the most famous films in the history of cinema, The Wizard of Oz. She was not the first choice. Studio chief Mayer had wanted Shirley Temple, the reigning child star of the era. Fox declined to loan her. Deanna Durbin was asked next. She was unavailable. And so, almost by accident, Frances Gumm, Judy Garland, put on the ruby slippers. They initially fitted her with a blonde wig. They ultimately decided against it. Her blue gingham dress was chosen specifically for its blurring effect on her figure, to make her look younger, thinner, less like a woman, more like a child. Because she was 16, and the studio was already embarrassed by the body she was growing into. Filming began on October 13th, 1938. And it was during those months on set that what had already begun at home, quietly, insidiously, before she had even walked through MGM's gates, became official policy. Here is what they fed her during production: chicken soup, black coffee, cigarettes. That was a working day's nutrition for a 16-year-old girl dancing and singing under hot studio lights for 12 to 18 hours at a stretch. And alongside that, the pills. Amphetamines in the morning, Benzedrine, pep pills, to suppress appetite, to keep energy levels high enough for another scene, another take, another hour. Barbiturates at night, to bring her down, to force sleep into a body that had been chemically accelerated all day. Up and down, every day. She was 16 years old. This was not something that happened once or twice as an emergency measure. This was the routine, the designed, deliberate, institutional routine. Biographer Gerald Clark, who wrote what is widely considered the definitive account of her life, Get Happy, The Life of Judy Garland, documented that by the time she was at MGM, Garland herself had stated that she and other young performers were constantly prescribed amphetamines to stay awake and keep up with the frantic pace of making one film after another, and that they were given barbiturates to take before bed so they could sleep. She would later say, "From the time I was 13, there was a constant struggle between MGM and me, whether or not to eat, how much to eat, what to eat. I remember this more vividly than anything else about my childhood." Let that settle. A woman looking back across her life. A life that contained Carnegie Hall and the Academy Awards and sold-out concert tours on 4 continents. And what she remembered most vividly was the fight over whether she was allowed to eat. In 1937 and 1938, Garland spent stretches of time making 2 films simultaneously. A typical day might begin with 3 hours of school, followed by 2 hours of singing rehearsal, followed by hours of filming. It was not unusual for her workday to end at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Then pills to sleep, then pills to wake, then do it all again. Her body never learned its own rhythm. Her nervous system never found its own equilibrium, because every time it tried, a chemical was waiting to override it. And then there was Louis B. Mayer. Multiple biographies, including accounts drawn from Garland's own partial memoir, document something that goes beyond professional misconduct. Mayer, who positioned himself to Garland as a father figure, particularly after the death of her real father, is documented as having sexually harassed her. Gerald Clark writes, using notes from Garland's own hand, that between the ages of 16 and 20, she was approached for sex repeatedly, by Mayer himself and by other studio executives. Mayer is said to have groped her in his office, to have placed her hand on himself while she was singing. She was a teenager, in a room with the most powerful man in Hollywood, a man who controlled her salary, her schedule, her diet, her pills, her public image, and her career. A man to whom she had nowhere to turn, because everywhere she could have turned, her mother, the studio, the industry that surrounded her, was connected to him, was dependent on him, was, in some cases, paid by him. There is a detail in the biographical record that stops you cold when you encounter it. According to biographer Gerald Clark, Ethel Gum, Judy's mother, was the first person to give her daughter pills, before MGM, before Mayer, before Hollywood. Ethel had begun giving amphetamines and sleeping pills to her daughter when Frances was not yet 10 years old, to keep her energized for performances, to bring her down afterward, her own mother. Judy Garland would later describe her mother as the real wicked witch of the West. She was not being colorful, She was being precise. The Wizard of Oz opened on August 25, 1939. The world fell silent. There is no other way to describe what happened when audiences first heard a 17-year-old girl stand at a wooden fence in a black-and-white Kansas farmyard and sing about a place somewhere beyond the clouds where trouble melts like lemon drops. They wept. Hardened men who had survived the Depression, women who had buried children, young people who had never felt that anyone had put into words the ache they carried. They all wept. And Judy Garland, who had been told since the age of 13 that her body was wrong, her face was wrong, her appetite was dangerous, her very existence required constant management, became overnight the most beloved entertainer in America. She was awarded a Special Academy Award the following year, a miniature Oscar, for her outstanding performance as a screen juvenile. She was 18. The world was celebrating her. And behind the dressing room doors, she was being chemically managed, physically surveilled, and, according to documented accounts, sexually exploited. The gap between those two realities is not incidental, it is the entire story. Through the early 1940s, the hits kept coming. Meet Me in St. Louis, Easter Parade, The Harvey Girls. Film after film after film, MGM had found something they could not manufacture artificially: genuine, piercing emotional authenticity. Every time Garland stood before a camera and opened her mouth, something real came out. Because she had no choice. She had been deprived of the emotional defenses that a normal childhood builds. She had been kept in a permanent state of managed vulnerability. And that vulnerability, that raw, unprotected quality, was exactly what audiences were responding to. They were watching someone who could not hide, and they called it talent. They were not wrong, but they did not understand the cost at which it came. In 1941, Garland, 19 years old, married composer David Rose. He was 30, she was 19. She married him, in part, to escape. Not from MGM, not from Hollywood, from her mother. She soon became pregnant. And then, in one of the most coldly documented moments in the record of her life, her mother and the studio executives pressured her to have an abortion. Her career, her image, the investment, these were the considerations. She complied. She would later speak about that abortion with a grief that never fully diminished. The marriage to Rose did not survive. They divorced in 1944. 3 years later, she married again, this time to director Vincente Minnelli. Minnelli was sophisticated, talented, and, like Francis Gumm before him, a man with secrets of his own. Their daughter, Liza, was born in 1946. But by the late 1940s, the machinery of Garland's life was beginning to show its damage. Years of amphetamines and barbiturates had destabilized her system profoundly. She was missing film shoots, arriving late, breaking down on set. MGM, which had created the conditions for everything that was happening to her, responded not with concern, but with punishment. Suspensions, salary cuts, public rebukes, the language of a corporation managing a malfunctioning asset. In 1949, she was admitted to a private sanatorium. She was 27 years old. She had been working since she was 2. She had been chemically managed since she was 10. She had been exploited since she was 13. She had lost her father at 13. Her first child, before it ever drew breath, had been taken from her at 19. And now the institution that had done all of this to her was describing her publicly as unreliable, difficult, temperamental. In 1950, she attempted suicide in a hotel bathroom in New York with a razor blade. She survived. And several months later, MGM, the studio to which she had given 15 years and the entirety of her youth, fired her. She had earned them millions. She had made them culturally immortal. She had given them The Wizard of Oz and Meet Me in St. Louis and Easter Parade, and a voice that no amount of money could have manufactured. And they handed her a termination notice and showed her the door. Part 4. Aftermath and Legacy. 8 to 12 minutes. Tone, quieter, heavier, the weight of what comes after. There is a particular kind of cruelty that comes after the fall. Not the cruelty of violence or overt malice, the cruelty of indifference, of a world that consumed everything you had and then moved on before you had recovered enough to understand what had happened. That was the world Judy Garland woke up in the early 1950s. Fired, struggling, chemically dependent in ways that would now be recognized as the direct result of systematic abuse that had begun in her childhood. But this is also where the story becomes something else entirely. Because Judy Garland did not disappear. She fought, with everything that had been taken from her, with a body that was already showing the damage of 2 decades of misuse, with a mind that had been conditioned since childhood to believe she was never quite good enough. She fought. In 1951, she agreed to perform at the London Palladium. The British press had already written the story they expected. Fallen Hollywood star attempts come back in foreign city. What they got instead was something that reportedly left the audience unable to speak. She sang for over an hour. She sang with everything she had. And the audience, who had come out of curiosity, perhaps even with a measure of pity, were on their feet before she was done. Then came 1954, and with it, the role that many believe was the finest acting performance of her career. A Star is Born. She played Esther Blodgett, a woman of immense talent being simultaneously elevated and destroyed by the entertainment industry. The parallels were not subtle. Critic Pauline Kael, one of the most respected voices in American film criticism, described her performance as one of the great performances in cinema history. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. She did not win. In one of the most documented snubs in Oscar history, the award went elsewhere. And Judy Garland, who had given, by most accounts, the performance of her lifetime, went home empty-handed. She had just given birth to her son, Joey Luft. The day before the ceremony, cameras had come to her hospital room. She was photographed with the baby and with oxygen tubes in her arm. The world watched, and then watched her lose. In 1961, she stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall. April 23rd, a Sunday night. What followed has been described, not by fans, but by serious music critics and cultural historians, as the greatest single night in the history of American live performance. The audience, which included some of the most distinguished names in entertainment, politics, and culture, gave her standing ovation after standing ovation. She performed for over 2 hours. She sang 26 songs. The album recorded that night, Judy at Carnegie Hall, spent 13 weeks at #1 on the Billboard charts. It made Judy Garland the first woman in history to win the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. Frank Sinatra, who was in the audience that night, called it the greatest concert he had ever seen. She was 38 years old. She had been working for 36 of those years. Her liver was already damaged. Her body was already in decline. And she walked out onto that stage and gave the greatest performance of the modern era. Because the stage was the only place she had ever been allowed to be herself. Not the MGM version, not the girl next door, not the managed, monitored, chemically regulated asset in a blue gingham dress. Just Judy, just Frances, just the girl from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, who had walked onto a stage at 2.5 and heard applause for the first time and understood in some wordless way that this was the only place she would ever feel safe, But even safety has a cost when it is the only kind you have ever known. The marriages continued, 5 in total. Each one a search for something that the stage could not provide. Stillness, constancy, someone who would stay when there was no performance to attend. Vincente Minnelli, Sid Luft, Mark Herron, Mickey Deans. Each marriage carrying within it the same essential tragedy. A woman who had been taught since infancy to perform love rather than receive it was trying to learn the difference. By the mid-1960s, the financial picture had become catastrophic. The IRS had come for her. Back taxes in the hundreds of thousands. Managers over the years had embezzled her earnings. Studios had underpaid her for decades. A woman who had earned millions and made studios richer than she could imagine was now, in a word that appears in multiple accounts of this period, effectively homeless, crashing between friends' houses, running on the last reserves of a body that had been running without proper fuel since 1935. And still, she performed. Not out of love for performance alone, though that love never left her, but because she needed money. Because the performers from her era received no pension, no safety net, no acknowledgement from the studios that had profited so enormously from their labor. She performed because it was the only thing she had ever been allowed to own. In 1969, she married Mickey Deans. He was 12 years younger than her. They had met, in a detail that feels almost too painful to recount, when he delivered a package of stimulant pills to her hotel room in 1966. On their wedding day in London, March 16, 1969, she told reporters, "Finally, I am loved." She was 46 years old. She had been seeking that sentence for her entire life. Her daughter Lorna Luft later wrote that at the time of that wedding, her mother was in the final stages of prescription drug addiction. She was dying in front of his eyes. Garland had travelled to London for a 5-week concert run at the Talk of the Town nightclub. It was meant to be a comeback, another Phoenix moment, another proof that she could not be counted out. Some nights it was. Some nights the old magic was there, that inexplicable combination of vulnerability and power that made audiences feel they were watching someone sing directly into their hearts. Other nights, it was devastating. She arrived on stage an hour and 20 minutes late. The late-night crowd was hostile. Cigarette boxes and rolls were thrown. She attempted 3 songs before leaving. A glass smashed on the stage behind her as she walked into the wings. One review from The Observer in January 1969 described her as thinner now, almost haggard. She gave her last performance on March 25, 1969, in Copenhagen, Denmark. And then she came back to London, to the rented Muse house in Belgravia that she shared with Mickey Deans, to the pills that she had never been allowed to live without. June 22, 1969. Mickey Deans woke in the morning and reached across the bed. She was not there. He found her in the bathroom, seated with her back against the bathtub, still. The coroner, Dr. Gavin Thurston, recorded the cause of death as barbiturate poisoning, incautious self-overdosage, accidental. The autopsy also revealed advanced cirrhosis of the liver. The coroner noted that this condition alone would likely have claimed her life within months. Her body had been warning her for years. Every doctor she had seen had warned her. She had begun taking those pills before she was 10 years old. She was 47. 21,000 people came to pay their respects in New York, over 2 days, in the heat of a June that was already charged with tension. Because on the night that Judy Garland was found dead in a London bathroom, something else was happening several blocks from the funeral home where her body lay. On the night of June 27, 1969, 4 days after her death, the night of her viewing, The Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street became the site of the uprising that would launch the modern LGBT rights movement. Many of the people in that crowd had been at her viewing earlier. This is not coincidence. This is not mythology. This is history. Judy Garland had been, for decades before her death, a figure of profound significance to gay men and women who lived in a world that told them their authentic selves were wrong. Too much, not enough, in need of management, in need of correction. She understood that language. She had been spoken to in it since before she could read. She had been told, from the age of 13, that her body needed to be changed, her nose, her teeth, her weight, her appetites, for food, for rest, for love, for simple human acknowledgement. She had performed a version of herself for the public, while the real Frances Gumm stayed locked somewhere behind the costume and the spotlight. And the community that had loved her recognized in that performance something they knew from their own lives. The necessity of the mask, the exhaustion of maintaining it, the dream of a place where you could finally take it off, somewhere over the rainbow. Part 5. Closing reflection. 2 to 3 minutes. Tone, quiet, final. The voice of someone setting down something heavy. We speak about the golden age of Hollywood with a particular kind of reverence. The glamour, the spectacle, the faces on those enormous screens that made the darkness of the Depression and the fear of wartime feel, for 2 hours, bearable. And it was real. That magic was real. But so was the machinery beneath it. The machinery that looked at a child and saw a product. That took a girl's voice and packaged it, profited from it, and discarded it when it became inconvenient. That put pills into a 10-year-old's hands and called it management. That put a grown man's hands on a teenager's body and called it the cost of doing business. That called a child too fat, too short, too plain, and then sold her to the world as the embodiment of pure innocence. Judy Garland did not fall. She was pushed, slowly, systematically, by people who should have protected her and chose instead to use her. And yet, when she stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall in 1961 and opened her mouth, something came out that 40 years of recording technology, of manufactured pop stars, of algorithmically optimized content, has never been able to replicate. Because what came out of Judy Garland when she sang was not performance, it was survival. It was 38 years of a woman who had been told she was not enough, proving 8 times a week to anyone who would listen that she was more than enough, that she had always been more than enough. The tragedy is not that she died at 47. The tragedy is that no one ever let her simply live. She sang about a place over the rainbow, a place where the dreams you dare to dream really do come true. She sang it at 17 in a costume designed to hide her body. She sang it at 30 in concert halls to people weeping in the dark. She sang it at 46 on a London stage while a hostile crowd threw things at her feet. And she always sang it as though she still believed somewhere that the place was real. That was not naivety. That was the most profound act of courage in the history of American entertainment. Her name was Frances Ethel Gumm. She was born in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. She wanted, she once said, to be a movie actress and a singer and a dancer. She became all 3. She became more than all 3. And she deserved, at minimum, to have someone ask her how she was doing and mean it. Rest now, Frances. You have been performing long enough.